If you have it handy, do you want to pull up a graph of what fat oxidation looks like versus power so that people can see the difference between a highly trained individual, a reasonably trained individual, an untrained individual, and at the other end of that spectrum, somebody with type 2 diabetes?
Sure. So let me share screen then, right? And hopefully this works. Okay. So this is from a publication, right, that my colleague George Brooks and I published in 2017. So this is the formula, and we have realized that this is flipped. So we need to send we're working now with the editor to change it because the formula is flipped here in the methods section.
Which is so funny, by the way. I like seeing that. I'm embarrassed to say when we do this for our patients, we do it in 2 steps, which yields the same result. But we first calculate energy expenditure using the Weir coefficients of 3.94 times VO2 minus or 1 plus 1 point, I think it's 1.2 times VCO2. And then we convert that to fat ox and carbohydrate oxidation using the ratio of VCO2 to VO2. And I never even thought to do what you've done here, which is so much more logical, which is combine them into a single equation for each.
Well, we use what Fryan observed already in 1983, and it's Fryan's equation, and it's been validated with tracers, with stable isotope tracers, and and that's what it shows. There's a very high correlation. Now, furthermore, in study that we were going to be publishing soon, we have validated this fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation directly with mitochondrial respiration. So in muscle biopsies, we inject directly fatty acids, pyruvate, representative of carbohydrates, right, and glutamine, representative of amino acids, and then we can see that there's a very high correlation between this indirect methodology to look at mitochondrial function and the direct methodology, which is through a muscle biopsy and injecting the substrate and see how it's oxidized, right? So
these 2 graphs are really powerful. So let's talk about what the first graph is showing us. The first graph is, so both of these graphs, it's important to note, have the same x-axis. In other words, the independent variable here is the workload in watts. That's the metric that matters in cycling, which is, I think, the easiest way to do this test. And so you're increasing wattage. This is a progressive increase in workload.
Yes.
And what you're plotting on the y-axis, your dependent variable here, in the first graph, figure 1, is blood lactate. So what stands out to me is a couple of things. So you have the triangles represent metabolic syndrome. The squares represent kind of a modestly trained athlete, and then the little diamonds represent a professional athlete. The first thing that stands out to me, and we're going to talk about this later, so I'll put a little pin in this, is that the people with metabolic syndrome have a resting lactate that's almost 2 millimole. Yeah?
Yes, we see already this, and it's I think that it's going to become more and more as a biomarker, like resting blood glucose levels.
Yes.
What is your resting lactate? And you can see already in patients with type 2 diabetes or profound metabolic syndrome that, as you say perfectly, resting levels are, in the neighborhood of like a 1.8, 1.5 to even 3, right?
So one of the metrics that we've discussed at length, and we'll revisit it, of course, is using this lactate level of about 2 millimole as being that threshold. So once lactate exceeds 2 millimole, the individual is now escaping out of zone 2, and they're actually now into zone 3. So when you look at these data here, you can see that the individual with metabolic syndrome is basically tapping out zone 2 initially. So any incremental workload that is placed on them takes them right out of zone 2. So they're, for all intents and purposes, by the time they're at 100 watts, they're already at the threshold of their zone 2. Now, conversely, when you look at that sort of medium trained or reasonably well trained individual, or I think it's referred to as moderately active, healthy individuals, they start out with a lactate of about 1, And it's not really until they hit about 175 watts that they pass that inflection point. And then when you look at the professional athletes, the professional endurance athletes specifically, they're starting out at a lactate level of 0.5 millimole, and they stay relatively flat until they hit about 300 watts is when they finally cross over that threshold. Now, what's not captured here is that as you move from left to right, the athletes are getting lighter. So this graph, if I'm going to be critical of it, Iñigo, I would say it should be done in watts per kilo. And that would show a much starker difference between these. And in our patients, when we benchmark them, we benchmark them in watts per kilo for this reason, so that you normalize by weight. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're absolutely right. It is that, and that's how we do it also.
Yes, of course.
It's just like one of the reviewers didn't allow us to use watts per kilogram. So
clearly that reviewer was an idiot. So that's fine. I won't hold it against you because you have an idiot reviewer. But yes,
you know how it is in review papers. You want to show something, and eventually it's changed, and it's not exactly sometimes what you want to show. Because otherwise they don't allow you to publish it. But anyways.
So, but what's amazing here is that person with metabolic syndrome is probably about 1 watt per kilo. Easily, right? Or, 1 to 1.3 watts per kilo is their zone 2. When you look at the modestly trained individual, they're about 2 watts per kilo, right? They probably weigh maybe 2 to 2.1, 2.2 watts per kilo. That professional endurance athlete probably weighs in the neighborhood of 70 kilos.
Yeah, exactly.
So, they're in the ballpark of 4 watts per kilo. For our patients, Iñigo, we typically we set the aspiration at 3 watts per kilo. So again, our patients aren't professional athletes, but we think that 3 watts per kilo would be kind of the elite level that we would want to see people. And then of course we stratify from there. Okay, let's look at the lower figure, figure 2, just beneath this. So here we're looking at the same group of individuals. We have the same independent variable, which is work, but now we're calculating fat oxidation as a function of that work. So now your dependent variable is fat oxidation, which again, very easy to calculate via indirect calorimetry. 2 things stand out again. The first is the obvious, which is the fitter the individual, the higher their absolute capacity for fat oxidation. But something else stands out to me, Iñigo, and I have now seen this repeatedly across multiple data sets, which is a fit individual actually increases fat oxidation to a local maxima before beginning that decline, whereas most mortals begin at a maximum and decline from there. Can you explain why that's happening?
Yes, it's something that I agree. I see this all the time, right? I think that on one hand is how you start the protocol, right? In this case, we started like at 1. We start about 1 to 1.5 watts per kilogram. And that obviously for an elite athlete is trivial, below resting levels. So this is what they're very low. And they don't need to use much fat for energy purposes until you push them more. And that's when you get to like 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5 watts per kilogram, right? And again, this protocol comes originally from the work that I've been doing for 20 years, the same protocol with elite athletes. Now, when you do the same protocol with other populations, especially people with metabolic syndrome or not very fit, and you start at 1.5 watts per kilogram, that might be too much, right? And I'm sure you have observed that if you start at 0.5 watts per kilogram, you might see a higher fat oxidations. And then you might see the same phenomenon. So on one hand is that protocol, but on the other hand, sure, like 0.5 watts per kilogram, it's like nothing, it's close to resting levels almost. So it will take you for a long time. But that being said, I think that one of the things that we're doing with populations, more clinical populations, is really start at a very low level, even up to 50 watts or 25 watts sometimes, So we can establish these points, because if you start at 2 watts per kilogram or 1.5 watts per kilogram with someone with a significant metabolic dysregulation, you're going to miss the fat max.
Yeah, and I agree. We have been struggling to tune our algorithm to exactly that, because I actually think that, and I had this discussion with our team a week ago, which was the physiologists who are doing this with our patients are probably overcooking the people who are not fit during the warm-up. So they do a warm-up, and the warm-up is actually too stressful, and it overcooks them, and then we're missing kind of the true max fat. Okay, so the next thing I want to point out here is that and let's just look at the fittest person, but it's true for all of them, but it's easiest to see here. Fat max, so fat max ox, right? So maximum fat oxidation is occurring earlier than lactate is 2. And that's true for all of them, except for the met sin person, because it's so low. But if you look at the moderately fit person, they're hitting maximum fat oxidation at about 130 watts, but they're hitting lactate of 2 at 175 watts in the upper figure. And the professional athlete is hitting an absolute fat oxidation maxima at a little shy of 250 watts, but they're hitting lactate of 2 closer to 300 watts. So I guess the question then becomes, which one of these do you think, well, you've already answered part of the question, which is we're really defining zone 2 as the place where maximum fat oxidation occurs. But I guess this would suggest that using a lactate level of 2 is maybe overestimating where that is. And should we be using a lower level of lactate, such as 1.5 or something like that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this is what I've been learning all these years, is that the blood lactate levels might change between different groups. And it's everything related to the lactate kinetics and lactate oxidation in the mitochondria. So, for example, elite athletes, and I did, this was part of my doctorate thesis, and some of this that I never published it 20 something years ago. But the same blood lactate concentration does not correspond to the same, in an elite athlete, does not correspond necessarily to the same lactate concentration in a recreational athlete. The metabolic stress. So for example, 2 millimoles or 2 millimolar, right, of lactate in these elite athletes might be a higher metabolic stress than 2 millimoles in a metabolic patient. Yeah. So this is why, and it would be very difficult. For example, you can have at let's say 2.5 millimoles, you can have a metabolic syndrome patient exercising for a couple hours without a big deal. You try to do that with a professional athlete, and they're going to be hurting, right? And in fact, one of the things that I observe is like I use the 4 millimole or millimolar, which is kind of that gold standard, has been forever, like the lactate threshold, etc. Yes. And if you put a world-class athlete at 4 millimoles of lactate at the intensity and power output that elicits 4 millimoles, and you put a recreational athlete at the power output that elicits also 4 millimoles, and you say, now go, right, and see who lasts the most, intuitively we're going to say, obviously, it's going to be the professional athlete. It's the opposite. And this is the data that I saw 20-something years ago, where the recreational athletes at the same blood lactate concentration would go about 30% longer period of time. And that's because metabolically it's not as tasking. Yep. And the main reason is that the lactate that we see in the blood, it reflects the mitochondrial oxidation. So someone who has, obviously, when we're talking about, high power output, when you need a lot of glycolysis to produce energy, you're going to produce lactate. Lactate is the mandatory, obligatory byproduct, not waste product, but byproduct of glycolysis. So the higher the glycolysis, the higher the lactate. Now that lactate has two routes mainly. One is going from the fast twitch muscle fibers to the slow twitch muscle fibers. It's the lactate shuttle that George Brooks discovered, and is oxidizing the mitochondria of those slow twitch muscle fibers. If you have a very good lactate clearance capacity, right, you're going to be oxidizing it very, very well for fuel. Therefore, you're not going to incur in the second step, which is exporting it to the blood, right? When you have a poorer mitochondrial function, it's going to get to a point that that capacity is going to get saturated at a lower power output, and therefore you're going to be forced to export that to the blood. So that's why looking at blood lactates might not mean the same. I'm not saying that disparities are huge, by no means, right? But as you very well said, those 2 millimoles might not correspond in an elite athlete with a fat max, but might be more maybe towards 1.5. Whereas maybe in someone with a more recreational or metabolic syndrome, it might correspond there. I don't know if it makes sense.
It completely makes sense. And this is definitely the level of nuance that I don't think we captured in the first podcast. And I want to now ask a more telling question specifically for the middle person here. So the one that's called the moderately active individual, where again, we have a disparity, right? So based on these data, the moderately fit individual hits a lactate of 2 millimole at 175 watts, but hits a max fat oxidation at, 125 watts. So it's a 50 watt difference. So now the question for you is, when that person comes to you and says, Iñigo, I want to improve my metabolic function, I want to improve my mitochondrial performance, I want to improve my fuel partitioning, my flexibility, all the things we talk about, are you going to train them as a zone 2 of 125 watts or as a zone 2 of 175 watts, as represented by these deltas?
That's a very good question. And normally I would try to do something in the middle. Normally, and again, it might not coincide perfectly, but normally they do quite well. And another parameter that if you allow me, I can show you in this paper. This is what, when decided, we see individually, right, the lactates.
Yes.
And then we see the fat oxidation. But then where I decided to cross them over, right? And this is what we saw in this graph over here. So this is, can you see it okay?
Yes.
So this is where you see that the lactate versus, the lactate versus the fat oxidation, right, in the elite athlete. And the R is 0.97. This is through Bonferroni equation. So this is an average, right, of all of them. And this is where you see the same pattern, the same graph for the moderately active. And this is also what you see in the person with metabolic syndrome. The correlations are very, very strong. They're almost perfect, right? So this is what normally fat oxidation and lactate, they go together, right?
So for people who are going to be listening to this, Iñigo, and not able to see what we're seeing, can you describe the differences between these graphs? These are obviously showing the same data that we discussed earlier, but now we're using two y-axes. So let's even just talk about it as looking at the elite athletes. So you're basically plotting the decline in fat oxidation, or in their case, the initial increase in fat oxidation followed by a decline in fat oxidation. And on the same graph, you're showing the increase in lactate production. Again, both plotted to the same x-axis of power. Does the cross point here indicate any significance? So they're crossing at about 325 watts. Is there anything about that that means anything? I mean, to me, I think it's an artifact of the graph because it's really just a function of how you scale it, correct?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, it shows to me that, the crossover point for blood lactate and fat oxidation, it's very high, obviously, in the elite athletes, very far to the right.
Right. So, and then of course, in the moderately fit people, looks like it's closer to 100 and maybe 80 watts.
Exactly.
And in the unfit individual, it's about 125 watts. A person with metabolic syndrome.
Yeah. And again, I mean, if you started, and I'm sure you have seen this, but if you started with the metabolic syndrome, for example, at 25 watts, you might see, or even in the recreational athlete, even earlier, you might see a similar pattern as you would see in the elite athlete, but a much lower watts, obviously. It is that we just did the same protocol for everybody, just to show the concept, right? That both fat oxidation and lactate go together. And also when we look into, and I'm sorry, I should have gone to this directly, when we look into fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation, we see the same concept, right? So we see as exercise intensity increases, you need to oxidize more carbohydrates. And then as exercise intensity increases, you might get to the fat max. And then in the moment you switch to the glycolytic fibers, you cannot use much fat for energy purposes. So you see a sharp decline, and eventually fat oxidation disappears. And it's all full glycolytic. And the same pattern we see in the rest of populations, with also very high statistical significances and correlations. So that's where like all these elements, fat oxidation, carbohydrates, and lactate, they're very well connected. If we look in the other graph, this is the correlation between lactate and carbohydrates, right? We see that overall the correlations are quite good because, yeah, lactate is the byproduct of glucose utilization, right? You may see that in the elite athletes, though, the gap is wider here. And this is for the same reason I was saying earlier. They use a lot of glucose.
They're using so much fat there as well, is really the point, right? So the bigger the gap between the blood lactate curve and the carbohydrate oxidation curve, the more efficient the individual is. The more they're able to oxidize fatty acid, then they have to require glucose.
And clear lactate.
Yes.
Again, the mandatory byproduct of glucose oxidation is lactate. So here the lactate doesn't show up in the blood.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's hard to disentangle those two because you mentioned a good point that I omitted. This in part reflects the lactate shuttle. This in part reflects the ability for them to reuse lactate as a fuel, as opposed to just letting it get out there with hydrogen and start to poison sarcomere.